Welcome. I'm Doug Morgan, and you're listening to Uncommon Sense, where we hunt for the truth in the topics you're not supposed to talk about, Christianity and politics. The other day, I saw someone just touting an article about how anti-science people were giving children measles. Yeah. Well, the gist of the story was that because people don't trust science and scientists anymore, parents are not getting children vaccinated, and we are seeing a resurgence in measles. But is this really the parents' fault? Or is it the fault of people like Dr. Anthony Fauci that calls himself science? As we covered in our FOMO Friday report, research universities like Harvard and Yale and Johns Hopkins and the like are taking the vast majority of grant money and pocketing it. Harvard has 53 billion with a B, over $53 billion in endowments. And guess how much they're taking from that science research? 69%, almost 70% of the money of the $53.2 billion goes to what they call indirect costs, which is basically just admin fees, and they're just pocketing the money. Yale's not much better, $41.4 billion in endowments and 67.5% indirect rate. I mean, we're talking over 2/3 here. Johns Hopkins, well, they get a little below the 2/3 mark with $13.1 billion in endowments and 63.7% direct percentage of indirect costs. I mean, literally, they're taking the majority of the money and running with it. Well, in a couple of opinion pieces from the Wall Street Journal comes this one. This is from a University of Colorado at Butler finance director, and his name is Aidan Alcott. And he said, before the pandemic, Americans saw scientists as nearly infallible brainiacs who achieved superhuman feats of innovation that pushed society forward. And when members of the public thought of the scientific community, they likely imagined researchers in goggles and long white coats, inspiring and inspecting microscopes in futuristic laboratories, armed with resources bestowed on them by university endowments and federal grants, and powered by lifetimes of study. Well, this picture shattered when science became synonymous with ideological heavy-handedness. Suddenly, in March of 2020, science was thrust into the national stage. Science, they said, is why healthy children and young adults must stay locked in their homes. Science, they said, is why you must mask and double mask. And Fauci even said triple mask. Science is why a person must quarantine for 2 weeks following a COVID diagnosis. Or maybe it was 10 days. It's no wonder that the percentage of Americans with a great deal of confidence in scientists has dropped 16% from the year 2020 to 2023, and even worse now. This supposed science was thrust on the American public, despite scientists' claims of certainty and terrible consequences if they weren't obeyed. Each order was followed by a contradictory order. While the public lived in desperation, scientists and bureaucrats felt no need to explain and no need to apologize. For the public to forgive them now, they must first offer a public apology, which, of course, they haven't done. Nathan Bennox, who is the University of Nebraska at Lincoln forensic scientist, He even said in his opinion piece there, he said the most significant reason Americans no longer have confidence in scientists is the abuse of power. When the pandemic hit, medical professionals and other scientists were given more power than ever before. Unelected officials, such as Anthony Fauci, were given control over public policy and implemented changes that were damaging to American society. The American people recognized this power grab for what it was, and as a result, the scientific community suffered. Public trust in scientists does matter, and modern society cannot continue to innovate without the work that scientists do. But scientists need to stick to their jobs and leave the job of governing to the politicians and the people who elected them. There is no doubt that scientific data should be consulted when drafting legislation, but scientists need to let the public officials do the job they were elected to do. Science is about discovery, not a drive for power. When scientists can go back to learning new things and let elected representatives propel civic behavior, Americans will become more trusting. Scientific innovation and government are two different things. But there is good news happening. This is not a downer piece here. There is good news happening because of our current president, actually. And an opinion piece in the Daily Wire by Matt Walsh says that just a couple of years ago, if you can believe it, leading scientists from all over the country held a symposium in Washington, along with federal officials from the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and the White House of Science and Technology Policy. According to a senior director at the NIH, the point of the symposium was to address a, quote, defining issue, unquote, of the current era. So the A-Team was going to tackle one of the most difficult and pressing matters in the entire field of scientific and medical research. Hearing that, you might conclude that these scientists were going to discuss, say, a cure for cancer or a major breakthrough in gene editing, or if nothing else, they might talk about the development of the 50th COVID booster or something like that. Surely, at a minimum, they would discuss a topic that had some kind of relevance to the field of health or science or technology. Those would all seem to be safe assumptions. And yet, at the risk of spoiling the symposium for you, in case you were hoping to catch the rerun, that didn't happen. And in fact, that didn't even come close to happening. Instead, here's what they came up with at the symposium full of leading medical and scientific experts in Washington. The first speaker in this clip is a professor at Notre Dame. And the second one is from the National Institute of Health, or the NIH. Here, listen.
LGBTQ plus students are more likely to leave STEM majors in favor of non-STEM majors by the end of their fourth year of college.
There are STEM-specific challenges here that we need to be understanding and addressing. We can't simply say that queer populations are underrepresented in STEM because they struggle broadly academically. Actually, no, they're crushing it academically. They're just being systematically funneled out of STEM and within STEM being mistreated. So hence the importance of the rest of the research that we'll be hearing from.
In DNI, I have two roles, and that one is to increase the engagement of SGM people. And so I'm meeting with them, talking to them, finding out what they need, what we need as, communities. If it's pronouns, if someone's in a lab and being misgendered, or if someone's going through the gender affirmation process, I'm there. I'm the one that does that, right? I'm the one that does the safe zone trainings quarterly. I'm the one that does it if the IC is having an issue. I'm brought in to have these conversations. And I feel like, so that's one role that's really geared towards members of the community itself. But the other is to have these conversations that are very hard with people who are transphobic or homophobic. And I have to hear horrible things, and I'm trans myself.
Now, for a second, try to ignore the fact that these people are making up fake complaints about the plight of the LGBTQ, P, S, M, whatever, plus people in STEM. Pretend they're not talking like dime a dozen panelists on MSNBC instead of actual scientists. That's actually not the worst part of this footage. The worst part of that already, you can tell that everyone at this symposium is saying the same thing. There's no debate whatsoever. The whole event was an extended struggle session in which only one point of view was allowed. And that point of view is that for some reason, gay people are being forced out of math classes. It should go without saying that this is a complete bastardization of everything scientists should be doing. They're supposed to be asking questions, using the scientific method of finding evidence to support every single one of their conclusions. This is supposed to come naturally to them. It's their job. Instead, they spent the entire event explaining why it's important to think the exact same way about this particular issue, even though every sane person knows that their theory makes absolutely no sense. For example, as the symposium goes on, one researcher with a nonprofit attempts to articulate why it's so important to hold struggle sessions like this. And then a senior official at the National Science Foundation offers his take. Here it is.
Oftentimes I get asked this question of, if you ask about these questions, aren't you creating division where there isn't any? This doesn't matter to science. Science is objective. And so why are we asking these questions? And the reality is that when we don't ask these questions, we live under the myths that these matters don't matter, and that actually science is such a pure meritocracy that we don't need to check and see our certain groups being equitably served.
It's important because, the data changes the conversation from just being opinion-based to evidence-based. And I agree with you. We shouldn't have to wait on the data. We know we got an issue. It should just be like Nike, just do it.
Oh, man. Every speaker is somehow more unbelievable than the last one. The first guy's trying desperately to explain why they're holding this symposium at all. And the best he can come up with is, well, when we don't ask these questions, we live under the myth that these matters don't matter. This is the kind of word salad that you have to produce when you know that, in fact, these matters do not matter and that all of these concerns are completely made up. And then the official from the National Science Foundation comes in and pretty much makes that point as explicitly as he can. He says that, quote, we shouldn't have to wait on the data because we know we've got an issue. So like Nike, we should just do it. In other words, who cares about the facts and the data when you have a narrative to push? All he knows is that we need DEI and affirmative action in science and medicine. He doesn't care if there's no reason whatsoever to justify any of this. He just knows he needs it to happen. For a very long time, the National Science Foundation, along with the NIH and many other federal agencies, has operated like this. They rake in billions of dollars worth of tax revenue with the promise of funding scientific achievements and advancements that benefit America. And then they've squandered it to advance a political agenda. And to be clear, he says, I'm not cherry-picking sound bites here or taking anything out of context. This is something we can quantify. The Senate Commerce Committee just released a report documenting precisely how much money the National Science Foundation, or the NSF, has wasted in recent years. Again, this is an agency of the federal government that we're talking about here. The Daily Wire reports this. They said the Senate committee found that 1 in 10 grants awarded by the National Science Foundation between January of 2021 and April of 2024 had to do with oppression, social or environmental justice, gender, or race. In other words, 1 in 10 grants have been completely fraudulent. There's no reason we should have been funding any of it, but the Biden administration made sure that we did. They kickstarted a lot of this fraudulent spending, and the Senate report found that in 2021, the first year of the Biden administration, less than 1% of grants from the NSF were focused on DEI initiatives. But by 2024, after 3 years of the Biden administration, more than a quarter of the new grants to the NSF pushed far left perspectives. They have researched and researchable database of these grants right now on their website. You can page through around 3,000 grants from the National Science Foundation that involve DEI. For example, in 2022, NSF gave Columbia University more than $4 million so that they could study ways to decolonize geoscience. Meanwhile, a professor at Northwestern received $1 million in 2023 so that he could put together, quote, story work for racial equity in STEM, unquote, featuring insights from Karl Marx even. Over at University of Pittsburgh, a professor received $1 million to argue that artificial intelligence should not be neutral because that, quote, only serves the capitalist, racist, heteronormative, patriarchal, etc. society, unquote. Another study funded by the NSF to the tune of $500,000 determined that the concept of peer review was racist. Quote, the accepted values and practices in science can serve as roadblocks and barriers to the inclusion and advancement of minoritized scholars. Wow. Again, there are thousands of grants like this. We're not talking about 1 or 2 examples. This was systemic fraud. And the only way to deal with systemic fraud like this is to clean house at the National Science Foundation, which is exactly what the Trump administration is doing now. Just because it feels appropriate, he says, I'll share some reporting on this development from Politico, which is yet another organization that just had its federal funding cut dramatically. Here it is. It says, one of the United States' leading funders of science and engineering research is planning to lay off between 1.25% of its staff in the next 2 months. This is a top National Science Foundation official said. The comments by Assistant Director Susan Margiles came at an all-hands meeting of the NSF's Engineering Directorate. Quote, a large-scale reduction in response to the president's workforce executive orders is already happening. This is what the spokesman of the Office of Personnel Management said. As significant as this development is, it's important to keep in mind that NSF is just one small part of a much larger fraud that's been taking place in the government. When it comes to research funding, in particular, the National Institute of Health is a far bigger offender in terms of financial waste. DOE's just found that the NIH had a contract worth more than $180 million for administrative expenses that didn't involve health care in any way. That included a contract to buy a Tony Fauci exhibit at the NIH Museum, for example. The Trump administration has also found that the NIH spends vast amounts of its research budget on so-called indirect costs. We just talked about that. Last year, roughly $9 billion of the $35 billion that NIH spent on research ultimately went to these indirect costs, which is a fancy way of saying administrative overhead for the universities and research institutions. For some institutions, these indirect costs amounted to more than 60% of their total grant funding. In other words, in a $1 million grant to, conduct cancer research, let's say, more than 600,000 might be going to non-research expenses like office supplies and things like that. Of course, in almost every case, there's no reason for this, and there's no reason for Harvard and Yale to rake in huge amounts of money for scientific purposes when the grant is supposedly a scientific grant. It's a pure grift in every sense. So now the Trump administration is ending that practice. They're capping these administrative payouts to around 15% of the total grant. What you may not know is that this isn't the first time Donald Trump has tried to do this, as the New York Times reports. They reported in 2017 during Mr. Trump's first term, a similar proposal would have reduced the overhead payments to 10% of the awarded amount. The effort faltered, and Congress then acted to ward off a future effort and passed a budget bill that prohibited changing the fees from the levels that had been negotiated between federal officials and each research institution. Does that even surprise you? In other words, Trump tried to cut waste at the NIH during his first term, but Congress shut him down. And they actually passed an appropriations bill that prevented him from cutting the administrative funding. And now, citing that appropriations law, a new lawsuit is trying to stop Trump from cutting the NIH funding again. And so far, the plan is working. The other day, the federal judge halted the NIH cuts with a preliminary injunction, and this has been happening consistently, as you may have noticed. And individual federal judges have also blocked the Treasury Secretary's access to internal files, prevented Doge's buyout offer for federal workers from going through. Of course, that one was overturned, and now they can go through with that. But they also attempted to block the closure of the USAID, which looks like it's going to go through. So that's good. Now it's clear that this will be a theme of the second Trump presidency, as it was in the first one. And judges are going to do everything they can to overturn what the voters want, which is for the executive branch to determine how the executive branch operates, right? Is it such a hard concept to understand? But already there are signs, most notably from J.D. Vance, that the administration recognizes that these judges are breaking the law and that their rulings may not be respected. In particular, this is what Vance wrote: if a judge tries to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tries to command the attorney general in how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. I mean, he's not wrong, right? He's spot on. This is an approach that obviously shouldn't be necessary. And if we had judges who respected the separation of powers, there wouldn't be an issue. But increasingly, unelected judges are telling the executive branch how to spend money and who to employ. That's not just unconstitutional, it's also unsustainable. There is zero popular political support for continuing these expenditures to corrupt agencies like the NSF and the NIH. And that's because between these revelations at the NSH, everything that happened with COVID and the embrace of gender theory, mainstream science has completely discredited itself. Now, when public celebrities, as scientists lose their funding and their jobs, they'll blame us for being anti-science. But our problem with them is precisely the opposite. The people we have been paying huge sums of money to, we're talking about billions of dollars, have been spending it on political propaganda and social engineering. They've been doing it for decades on the assumption that no one would ever notice or do anything about it. But now, very abruptly, that has changed. Everyone can see that many of the so-called scientists in the federal government were the ones who were actually anti-science. And now that they're losing their jobs and their infinite supply of taxpayer money, the work of serious people, of actual scientists, can finally begin. But this is not a new thing, or because of COVID. I go back to a blog, actually, by Ralph B. Alexander, and this goes back to before COVID. It goes back to 2019, January 14th of 2019. And I'm going to read just part of this. And it says, one of the most obvious signs that modern science is ailing is the reproducibility crisis. The vast number of peer-reviewed scientific studies that can't be replicated in subsequent investigations and whose findings turn out to be false. In the field of cancer biology, for example, researchers discovered that an alarming 89% of published results couldn't be reproduced. Even in the so-called soft science of psychology, the rate of irreproducibility hovers around 60%. And to make matters worse, falsification and outright fabrication of scientific data is on the rise. The reproducibility crisis is drawing a lot of attention from scientists and non-scientists alike. In 2018, the U.S. NAS, or National Association of Scholars, and an academic watchdog organization that normally focuses on the liberal arts and education policy, published a particularly comprehensive examination of the problem. Although the emphasis in the NAS report is on the misuse of statistical methods in scientific research, the report discusses possible causes of irreproducibility and presents a laundry list of recommendations for addressing the crisis. But a lot of those things were never adhered to. You see, the cutting corners to pursue short-term success is but just one consequence of pressures experienced by today's scientists, he says. These pressures include the constant need to win research grants, as well as to publish research results in high-impact journals. The more spectacular that a paper submitted for publication is, the more likely it is to be accepted, but often at the cost of research quality. It has become more important to be the first to publish or to present sensational findings than to be correct. And you see, it goes on, but I will say that the other issue here is where the money's coming from. The vast majority of money is coming from the government, and the government has an agenda, and it has a narrative to drive. It is a political animal. And so if you are a scientist and you want to get money, I mean, it's you have to have money in order to do the science, right? And so you look for these grants, and these grants are given by a government that has a narrative and has something to push, a story to push. And so if you say, hey, I will help you push that story by coming up with something scientific, then you're going to get the money. It's just that simple. You follow the money. And if you say, well, but wait a minute, I don't, let's say they want to push transgenderism and how wonderful transgenderism is, right? Well, if you come up and say, well, I'm looking for a study that's going to prove that transgenderism isn't even real, well, they're not going to fund you. But if you come up and say, hey, I want to show you, I want to produce a study if you will give me the money that shows how transgenders, they're marginalized and they're fearful and all this kind of stuff, right? You're going to get the money for that. And so science has basically bastardized itself in order to follow the money. They have gone after the money, and we're not seeing results that are scientific. We're seeing just a narrative and propaganda being produced by scientists in the name of science. And it's not science. It's nothing like science. It's not looking at facts. It's not coming up with something that it can be scientifically replicated. It's not. And so that's another reason why science has just simply been corrupted. And now we're starting to see where all of this has been happening. And the Trump administration and Doge and all this are going after it. And it's finally high time that it happened. I would love to hear from you on it, because this is just, it's another reason. It's another pillar of our society. It's just another area in which the trust in that pillar, in that institution, has completely gone in the toilet, and it's their own fault. It is. And so how do we get back to that? I would love to hear from you on it. And of course, you can always do that at uncommonsensepodcast.com, and of course on YouTube now. Would love to have you subscribe as well. Thank you for listening. This podcast is a production of Morganite Communications.